She stepped off that stagecoach like a wound that hadn't healed yet. Silk dress, locked chest, soft hands that had never seen a day of frontier dirt. The year was 1884, and the dusty town of Broken Bow, Wyoming, had seen plenty of mail-order brides come through. Weathered women built for hard winters and harder men. But this one looked like she belonged behind a piano in a Philadelphia parlor, not standing in the middle of a dying cattle town where the wind bit through your coat and the ground cracked like old leather. The whispers started before she even touched the ground. That's Silas Vance's bride. Lord have mercy, he's finished. Porcelain doll like that won't last a single Wyoming winter. They laughed, openly, without shame, and the man who had sent for her, Silas Vance, iron-jawed, hollow-eyed, a man already drowning in debt and dying cattle, looked at her across that dusty street and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not hope, grief. The quiet, furious grief of a man who realizes he has just made the worst mistake of his life. She looked like she belonged in a ballroom. She was about to save a dying empire with tools no one knew she had. But before we get there, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the judgment before you even opened your mouth? Have you ever carried something inside you, a gift, a skill, a truth, that the world refused to see because of how you looked, where you came from, or who they decided you were before you spoke a single word? Have you ever been written off, completely, publicly, or cruelly, and had to choose between defending yourself and simply proving them wrong? Ashley Miller chose the second option. And what Silas Vance didn't know, what nobody in Broken Bow knew, was that the woman they were laughing at carried something in that locked chest that would change everything. The ranch, the county, and the lives of every single person who dared to underestimate her. This story is going to hurt before it heals. Stay with us, because it gets wilder from here. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy frontier stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Wyoming Territory, 1884. To understand what was at stake, you need to feel the land first. This was not a place that forgave weakness. The wind came off the mountains like a punishment. Cold, relentless, carrying the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest until he either hardened or cracked. The territory didn't care about your plans, your prayers, or your pride. It took what it wanted and left the rest to rot in the sun. And yet, men came. They staked claims, drove cattle across impossible distances, and built something from nothing with bleeding hands and sheer grinding will. Silas Vance was one of those men. He had arrived in this country 16 years earlier with $40, a used saddle, and a stubbornness that bordered on violence. He had carved the Ironwood ranch out of raw Wyoming earth, acre by painful acre, until it became something real and something that mattered, the kind of thing a man would die before he let go of. At its height, Ironwood Ranch had been the pride of the entire county, 1,200 acres of grazing land, a herd of Hereford cattle that other ranchers came from 3 counties over just to look at, a bunkhouse that ran tight and clean, full of men who respected Silas because he worked harder than any of them and never asked for what he wasn't willing to give first. That was 3 years ago. Now, the fences sagged in places no one had gotten around to fixing. The big house, always more cabin than mansion, had drafts that no amount of patching seemed to cure. The bunkhouse was quieter than it should have been. Men had left, not because they wanted to, but because Silas couldn't pay them enough reason to stay. And the cattle. God, the cattle. Our ruthless winter had arrived without mercy 2 seasons back, killing calves before they ever had a chance. Then came the summer of blackleg, a disease that moved through a herd like a whisper before it became a scream. Silent, fast, devastating. Silas had watched his best animals go down one by one, their legs stiff, their bodies collapsing under the weight of something he couldn't fight with a rifle or a fence line. He was losing the war, and he knew it. People in Broken Bow describe Silas Vance in short sentences. Hard man, fair man, quiet man. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. He had the kind of face that had stopped expecting good news long ago. His jaw was set like a steel trap, and his eyes, grey, steady, unreadable, were the eyes of a man who had learned to process pain privately. The way you process a wound in the field. You don't cry about it. You bandage it. You keep moving. He had never married, never found the time, or perhaps never found the reason. But the ranch had always been enough. The ranch had always been the point. Now the ranch was bleeding out, and no amount of hard riding or grim determination was going to stop it. Debt had a way of doing what weather and disease started. The bank wasn't his friend, and hovering at the edges of his shrinking world, like a crow on a fence post, was a name that made the men in Broken Bow lower their voices when they said it. Barnaby Thorne. He hadn't shown his face at the Ironwood yet. Men like Barnaby Thorne rarely did their own dirty work. He was a land speculator, the kind that arrived after disasters, not during them. He wore city suits in a frontier town and spoke the language of banks and deeds and legal pressure with the ease of a man who had destroyed other people's livelihoods so many times it had stopped feeling like anything at all. Thorne had been watching Ironwood Ranch, the way a patient man watches a fire burn itself down to coals. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. Every head of cattle Silas lost, every payment he missed, every week the bank grew less sympathetic. That was Thorne moving closer. Not with guns, with paperwork, with patience, with money enough to turn the law into a tool. He was already winning. Silas just didn't know how fast. Silas Vance was not a man who asked for help. That fact alone had cost him more than he would ever admit. But by the autumn of 1884, the arithmetic was undeniable. He couldn't manage a failing ranch, track dying cattle, fight off a land speculator, and keep a household running with his own 2 hands. Something had to give. He didn't need love. He had buried that particular hope somewhere in the middle of his second hard winter, and he hadn't dug for it since. What he needed was a partner, someone to keep the books, manage the hearth, hold the domestic side of things together, while he focused on saving what was left. So he did the one thing that pride had kept him from for years. He placed an advertisement in a St. Louis circular. Rancher, Wyoming Territory. Seeks capable woman for practical marriage. Honest work, honest life, no pretense. But the woman who answered that ad wasn't who anyone expected, and she wasn't coming west for the reason anyone assumed. In Philadelphia, and the name Miller had once opened doors. Not just doors, the right doors, the kind with brass handles and men in tailored coats standing behind them, nodding with the particular respect reserved for old money and older reputation. The Miller family had been woven into the city's social fabric for 2 generations. Physicians, academics, men of standing who sat on hospital boards and dined with politicians. Ashley had grown up inside that world. She knew its language, its rhythms, its unspoken rules about who spoke first and who stayed silent. She had attended the right schools, worn the right dresses, performed the right kind of quiet femininity that Philadelphia society demanded from its daughters. She had done everything correctly, and then the money ran out. Her father's reputation, already quietly controversial in medical circles, collapsed under the weight of a procedure that powerful men decided had gone too far. The board moved against him. The clients disappeared. The house went next. Then the accounts. The Miller name still existed. It just didn't mean anything anymore. But something had happened inside that house long before the money left. Her father, Dr. Edmund Miller, was a difficult man. Stubborn, obsessive, brilliant in ways that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable. He had ideas about medicine that were decades ahead of the institutions that feared them. And from the time Ashley was 11 years old, he had made her his student. Not officially, never officially. In the evenings, after the social calls were done, and the house had gone quiet, Edmund Miller would spread his journals across the dining table and teach his daughter the things the medical schools refused to teach anyone who wasn't a man. Anatomy, pathology, surgical procedure, the specific language of disease, how it moved, how it announced itself in tissue and blood, and the particular way an animal held its weight when something was wrong inside. By the time Ashley was 19, she could diagnose conditions that practicing physicians in the city were misreading entirely. By the time she was 23, her father's career was destroyed, and she was left holding an education that the entire world had decided she wasn't allowed to use. She had tried. That part of the story rarely gets told, but it matters. Ashley Miller had not gone quietly into the role of ruined debutante. She had written letters to 3 medical institutions requesting formal entry. She had asked her father's remaining colleagues, the ones who hadn't abandoned him entirely, to advocate on her behalf. Every door closed, not with cruelty, always. Sometimes with a kind of practiced, infuriating politeness. We appreciate your interest, Miss Miller. The program is not suited to women at this time. As though her knowledge had an expiration date, as though everything her father had poured into her across 12 years of quiet, relentless education simply didn't count because of the name on her birth record. The anger she felt was not the hot, explosive kind. It was the coal kind, the kind that doesn't burn out, the kind that settles into a person's bones and becomes fuel, slow, steady, and almost impossible to extinguish. She found the St. Louis Circular by accident. A copy left in a reading room, folded open to the back pages where ranchers advertised for wives the way merchants advertised for dry goods. Rancher, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman, practical marriage, honest work. She read it 3 times. And then she thought about Wyoming Territory, raw, barely governed, a place where law was still being invented and social rules hadn't calcified yet into the immovable walls she kept walking into in Philadelphia. A place that needed things done more than it needed things proper. She wasn't looking for a husband. She was looking for a frontier where her skills could breathe before anyone thought to ask whether a woman was allowed to have them. She wrote back that same evening. Not with desperation, with calculation. She packed her father's surgical tools, his leather-bound journals, and every vial, instrument, and reference text she could fit into one heavy, lockable chest. Then she bought a ticket west. She told anyone who asked that it was full of sewing supplies. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever did. Because a woman traveling alone with a large locked chest was, in their minds, obviously carrying domestic things. Thread and needles, and perhaps some fine fabric, too delicate to risk, with the baggage handlers. They never considered that the weight of it came from steel instruments wrapped in oilcloth, from glass vials packed in sawdust, from 6 leather-bound journals filled edge to edge with her father's handwriting and her own, case studies, botanical toxicology, veterinary pathology, and surgical notes on procedures she had assisted with in secret. She kept it locked because the world she was moving through had already proven repeatedly that it would take one look at those contents and decide she had no right to them. On the frontier, she intended to decide that for herself. She hid her greatest gift to survive a world that wasn't ready for her. The question is, are you the kind of person who recognizes that gift when it's right in front of you? Subscribers do. They don't miss what matters. If you're still on the fence, drop a comment. Tell me why a story like this isn't worth your subscription. I want to hear it. The stagecoach rolled into Broken Bow just past noon on a Thursday. It was the kind of arrival that a town remembers. Not because it was grand, but because it was wrong in every visible way. The door swung open, and Ashley Miller stepped down onto the dirt street in a silk dress the color of pale cream, 3 seasons out of fashion and completely unsuited for Wyoming dust. Her hair was pinned precisely, her gloves were clean, and in her arms, braced against her body like something she would not put down under any circumstance, was the heavy locked chest. She looked at Broken Bow. Broken Bow looked back. For a full 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Then the whispers began, low at first, spreading outward through the gathered onlookers the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast, hungry, unstoppable. That's her? Lord above. Silas sent all the way to St. Louis for that? They didn't bother to hide it. That was the part that would have broken a lesser woman. The openness of their contempt. A group of men outside the feed store didn't lower their voices. 2 women near the dry goods shop turned to each other with tight, satisfied smiles. The kind that said, "We always knew this would end badly for him." A boy of about 12 laughed outright until someone cuffed the back of his head. Not out of decency, but out of wanting to keep the moment for the adults. Silk dress, locked chest, hands that had clearly never gripped a fence post or hauled a water bucket in their life. She was wrong for this place. Every person on that street could see it. And Silas Vance, standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat pulled low and his jaw set like a man preparing for bad news he'd already half received, saw it clearest of all. He had told himself he wasn't expecting much. He had been wrong about that, because when he saw her, really saw her, something in his chest dropped with a weight that surprised him. He had needed someone sturdy, someone who understood what it meant to work from before sunrise to after dark, who wouldn't flinch at the smell of a sick animal or the sight of a hard winter coming in fast off the mountains. Instead, he had a woman who looked like she'd never been cold a day in her life. He crossed the street, introduced himself in 4 words, took her bag, not the locked chest. She made that clear without speaking, simply tightening her grip until he let go, and walked her to the wagon without ceremony. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. She didn't wait for it. The ride from Broken Bow to the Ironwood ranch was 10 miles of broken road and cold quiet. Silas drove the wagon and said nothing. He stared at the trail ahead with the focused intensity of a man who had already begun calculating how much a return stagecoach ticket to Philadelphia was going to cost him, and how soon he could arrange it without it looking like the failure it absolutely was. Ashley sat beside him with the locked chest across her knees and watched the land. She noted the quality of the soil. Dry, but not dead. She noted the creek line in the distance, the direction of the grazing fields, the angle of the afternoon light across the ridgeline. She said nothing either, but she was not silent the way he was silent. She was thinking. The ranch came into view just as the light began to turn golden and flat across the valley. It was worse than she had prepared herself for. The main house was a large cabin that had been added onto in sections over the years, each addition slightly misaligned, giving the whole structure the look of something that had been repaired too many times by men in a hurry. 2 windows on the eastern side had been patched with oil paper instead of glass. The porch sagged on the left. The smell reached her before they were fully through the gate. Rot, yes, but also the particular heaviness of a place where sick animals had been, the kind of smell that clung to the air long after the animals themselves were gone. 2 men came out of the bunkhouse as the wagon stopped. The older one, weathered, barrel-chested, with the permanent squint of a man who had spent 40 years reading weather, looked at Ashley the way a carpenter looks at a crack in a load-bearing beam. That was old Thad Boone. The younger one, Gideon Cross, didn't even try to disguise the smirk. Ashley looked at both of them with the calm, assessing eyes of someone who has already decided that what other people think of her is a problem she'll solve later. She was assigned to the kitchen before she had put down her bag. She accepted without argument. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply looked around the dying ranch and started counting what could be saved. The bunkhouse had a running wager by the second morning. Gideon Cross had put 2 bits on scorched biscuits. Old Thad, who considered himself a fair man, gave her until the end of the week, before she either burned the kitchen down or sent a letter home begging for a return ticket. The other hands, 4 of them, lean and weathered and deeply uninterested in the domestic arrangements of their employer, simply assumed the Philadelphia woman would be useless and adjusted their expectations accordingly. What they got instead stopped the conversation cold. The kitchen ran. Not adequately, precisely. Meals appeared at the correct hours, hot and substantial, without drama or complaint. The supply inventory, which had been a disaster of overlapping notes and guesswork left by the previous arrangement, was reorganized within 48 hours into a clean, itemized ledger that Silas stared at for a long moment before setting it down without comment. She wasn't what they expected. That was only the beginning of it. What the men didn't track, because they weren't looking, was where Ashley went when the kitchen work was done. She was up before any of them. Not to start the fire or begin the morning meal, though those things were done and waiting by the time the hands emerged from the bunkhouse. She was up because the hour before dawn, when the ranch was absolutely still, was the only hour she had entirely to herself. She used it. She walked the perimeter of the grazing fields in a systematic pattern, moving north to south, then east to west, covering ground methodically in the grey pre-light, with a small leather satchel over her shoulder. She crouched at the creek bed and collected water samples in glass vials, stoppered and labelled with the date and precise location. She pulled soil from the ground near the northern water troughs, wrapped it in oilcloth, and stored it in her room beside the remaining contents of her chest. She filled her journals every evening by lamplight. Observations, measurements, patterns, questions she was beginning to find answers to that nobody had yet thought to ask. It was Gideon Cross who noticed it first, though he wouldn't have been able to name what he was smelling. A sharp, clean chemical scent. Not unpleasant exactly, but deeply out of place in a ranch bunkhouse in Wyoming Territory. It drifted from beneath the door of Ashley's room in the evenings and sat in the hallway, like a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Old Thad knew enough to know it wasn't perfume. He had been around enough field medicine in his time. Enough wounds packed and enough fevers sweated out in rough conditions to recognize the edge of carbolic acid when it reached him. That smell meant instruments, and that smell meant someone preparing for something medical. He said nothing to Silas, but he started watching Ashley Miller with the focused, quiet attention of a man who has realized that what he assumed about a situation was wrong and hasn't yet decided what the truth actually is. Meanwhile, the cattle kept dying. 5 head a night had become the rhythm of the Ironwood, a brutal, steady drumbeat of loss that Silas tracked in the ledger with the mechanical precision of a man who has run out of the energy to feel each entry individually. He rode the fields every day. He checked the water. He moved the herd. Nothing changed. Doc Halloway arrived twice that month, collected his fee both times, and offered the same diagnosis with the same confidence of a man who had stopped caring whether he was right. Bad water, and possibly bad grass. These things happened on the frontier. Not much to be done. Silas knew Halloway was wrong. He just didn't know what the right answer was. What he didn't know was that a woman he had nearly dismissed on sight had already identified the pattern that Halloway had missed entirely. The deaths weren't spreading outward the way a natural blight moved. They were concentrated, deliberate, specific to the northern boundary. It wasn't random. It had never been random. Ashley cross-referenced every death against her field notes: date, location, proximity to water source. Physical symptoms she had observed herself by walking the fields after dark when no one was watching. The particular rigidity in the legs, the discoloration around the mouth, and the way the affected animals had been grouped near the northern troughs, and almost never near the southern creek bed, where the water ran clean and fast. She had a theory by the end of the first week. She had evidence by the end of the second. But evidence that lives in a woman's leather journal. A woman nobody on this ranch had yet decided to take seriously, is not the same thing as proof. Proof required documentation that couldn't be dismissed. Proof required a chain of findings so specific, so technically grounded, so impossible to wave away as feminine hysteria that even a frontier magistrate with no patience for complexity would have to stop and reckon with it. She had already found the answer. She just needed one more thing, proof that no magistrate could ignore. It happened on a Tuesday evening, just as the last light was leaving the sky. One of the younger hands came running from the barn with the kind of speed that meant something had gone wrong that couldn't wait. Boots hitting the dirt hard, voice cracking when he called out for Silas across the yard. By the time Silas reached the barn door, midnight was already on his side. The stallion was the finest animal on the Ironwood. 16 hands of pure black muscle, with a temperament that was difficult and a bloodline that had cost Silas more than he had ever admitted to anyone. He had turned down 3 serious offers for that horse in the last 2 years alone. Midnight wasn't just valuable. He was the kind of animal a man built a future herd around. Lose him, and the breeding program Silas had spent 6 years constructing went with him. The horse lay in the straw, his sides heaving, legs trembling with the effort of breathing. His eyes were glassy. His fever was visible from the doorway. Doc Halloway was summoned and arrived smelling of whiskey and wearing the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome before examining the patient. He crouched beside Midnight for less than 2 minutes. He checked the eyes, pressed 2 fingers briefly against the horse's neck, and stood up with the slow, resigned movement of someone delivering news they consider inevitable. "Fever's too far gone," he said, brushing straw from his knees. "Animals suffering. Best thing now is to end it clean." He said it the way men say things they've said too many times, without weight, without grief, without the slightest consideration that he might be wrong. Silas stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked to the wall where his Winchester hung on 2 iron hooks and took it down. The barn went quiet the way places go quiet when something final is about to happen. Every man present holding himself motionless, not looking directly at Silas or the horse. Nobody saw Ashley move until she was already there. She had been standing at the back of the barn. Nobody had noticed her come in, which was something she was practiced at. And now she was standing between Silas Vance and his horse, her back to the Winchester, her face toward him. The barn went a different kind of still. Silas stared at her, his jaw tightened. "Move aside." She didn't move. "Move aside, Ashley." "Give me 5 minutes," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not shake. It carried the particular quality of a voice that has made decisions and is not interested in negotiating them. 5 minutes and boiling water and a clean blade. That's all I'm asking for. Something happened in that moment that none of the men present would be able to fully describe afterward. The woman they had watched move quietly through the background of the ranch for 2 weeks. The silk dress mistake, the Philadelphia ornament, the kitchen assignment, had simply ceased to exist. The person standing in front of Silas Vance now had eyes like drawn steel. Silas didn't say yes, but he didn't raise the rifle either. And in the silence of that hesitation, Ashley turned to the nearest hand, Gideon Cross, who was standing closest with his mouth slightly open, and said, "Boiling water, now, and I need that lamp brought lower." Gideon Cross, who had smirked at her arrival and made no effort to hide his contempt for the past 2 weeks, went to get the water without a single word of argument. She brought the chest from her room herself, carrying it at a pace that said she had done this before. Not running, but moving with the focused economy of someone who does not waste motion when there is work to be done. She set it on the barn floor, produced a small key from inside her collar and opened it. The men saw what was inside. Not lace, not thread, not the domestic contents of a proper woman's traveling case. Steel instruments in oilcloth, glass vials in fitted compartments, 6 leather-bound journals with spines marked in her father's handwriting and her own, a set of surgical tools that caught the lowered lamplight and threw it back in cold, precise gleams. Old Thad Boone, who had not made a sound in 20 minutes, said quietly, "Lord in heaven." What followed was unlike anything those men had seen on the frontier or anywhere else. Ashley worked with a stillness that was almost frightening. Not the stillness of hesitation, but of total concentration, the kind that shuts out everything except the task directly in front of it. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, her instructions were short and exact. "Hold this. Keep the light here. Don't let him roll." She diagnosed the fever's source in the first 4 minutes. An infected abscess, deep and hidden, that Holloway's 2-minute examination had missed entirely. She cleaned the site with carbolic solution, but she made the incision with a steadiness of hand that made at least 2 of the watching men look away, not from disgust, but from the sheer discomfort of witnessing someone be that precise under that kind of pressure. Silas did not look away. He stood at Midnight's head the entire time, one hand on the horse's neck, and watched Ashley Miller work with the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation is being rebuilt from the ground up, piece by piece, cut by careful cut, and who is not yet sure what the finished picture is going to look like. It took 40 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. The first grey light of morning was coming through the barn slats when midnight got his legs under him. It was slow, uncertain at first, the horse shifting his weight, testing, and the fever glaze clearing from his eyes degree by degree. Then he was up, standing in the straw, side still, breathing even, head lifting with something that looked almost like indignation at having been horizontal in the first place. Nobody cheered. The moment was too large for that. Old Thad turned away and appeared to be studying something of great interest on the barn wall. Gideon Cross sat down on a hay bale and said nothing for a long time. The younger hands looked at each other with the wide, recalibrating eyes of people who have just witnessed something they don't have a category for. Silas looked at Ashley. She was closing the chest, cleaning her instruments with the quiet efficiency of someone who considers the work finished and is already thinking about what comes next. She didn't look up for his approval. She didn't look up for his gratitude. She didn't need either. That chest wasn't full of sewing supplies. It never was. She risked everything on one moment, and it changed the whole ranch. People who leave now will never know what she does next. That's not a risk worth taking. Subscribe, or drop a comment telling me why you'd rather miss it. The morning after midnight stood up. Ashley Miller changed her routine. She still rose before dawn. She still had the kitchen running before the hands emerged from the bunkhouse. But now she added something that made the crew uncomfortable in a way they couldn't immediately name. She began walking out to where the dead steers lay before the hands could drag them off for disposal, and crouching beside each carcass with her journal open and her instruments laid out on a clean square of oilcloth. She called it documentation. The men called it disturbing and kept their distance. But she was precise in a way that transformed what looked like grim, inexplicable behavior into something closer to a courtroom procedure. She noted the date, the location, the proximity to the nearest water source. She examined the mouths, the legs, the muscle tissue. She recorded the specific physical presentation of each animal with the same methodical attention her father had drilled into her across years of late-night instruction. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no conclusions drawn before the evidence earned them. By the fourth morning, the evidence had earned one. It was the water troughs near the northern boundary that kept pulling her back. The creek water ran clean. She had confirmed that across multiple samples taken at different points and different times of day. The southern grazing fields showed no pattern of concentrated deaths. But the northern troughs told a different story entirely, and it was written in the soil around them and in the stomach contents of the animals dying closest to them. Lupinus argenteus, silvery lupine. She had found traces of its seeds, ground fine, almost to a powder, in a way that did not happen naturally, concentrated in the water troughs along the northern fence line. The plant itself grew across Wyoming Territory in scattered patches, and under normal circumstances presented a manageable risk that experienced ranchers knew to monitor and control. But this was not normal circumstances. Silvery lupine did not bloom in this density this late in the season. The concentrations she was finding were not the result of wind scatter or natural growth patterns. The seeds had been processed, deliberately ground to increase their toxicity and accelerate absorption, and introduced into the water supply at specific, targeted locations. Someone had done this by hand. Someone had been doing it repeatedly. She spent 3 days mapping it, working from her journal notes and the physical evidence still present in the soil. Ashley traced the seed distribution patterns outward from the troughs. following the faint, scattered trail of residue that a careful person might have noticed, and a careless one would have missed entirely. She moved on foot, marking positions in her journal with precise measurements and compass bearings she had taught herself from one of her father's navigation texts. The trail did not scatter randomly in multiple directions the way natural dispersal would. It moved north, consistently, deliberately, in a line that followed the fence boundary of the Ironwood's northern pasture, and continued past it, across the narrow strip of disputed grazing land, toward the property line of the largest landholding in the county, Barnaby Thorne's land. She stood at the fence line in the early morning cold and looked north across Thorne's territory and felt the specific clarifying anger of a person who has just confirmed something they suspected but hoped was wrong. This wasn't blight, and this was a crime. She waited until evening, until the hands had cleared the table and the bunkhouse door had closed, before she laid her journals open in front of Silas Vance. She didn't editorialize. She walked him through the findings the same way she would present them to a medical board, location by location, sample by sample, the map trail running north with the kind of directional consistency that left no room for coincidence. Silas didn't speak for a long time after she finished. When he did, it was one word, said very quietly, in a tone that carried more danger than shouting would have. Thorne. The rage came first, a visible tightening across his entire frame, hands flat on the table, jaw locked so hard the muscles in his face stood out like cable wire. Then disbelief, because even knowing what Thorne was, and a man had to absorb the reality that someone had looked at everything he had built and decided to kill it one animal at a time. Then the rage came back, colder this time, settled, the kind that doesn't burn out in an hour. She showed old Thad the journals the next morning. He read slowly, moving his finger along the entries the way men do when they're making sure they haven't misread something they can't quite accept. When he looked up, the suspicion that had lived in his face since Ashley's arrival was gone, replaced by something older and quieter and considerably more serious. "How long have you known?" he asked. "The pattern was clear by the end of the first week," she said. "I needed the trail mapped before I said anything." Old Thad nodded once. That was all. Gideon Cross took it harder. Not because he doubted the findings, but because accepting them meant accepting that he had spent 2 weeks dismissing the only person on the ranch paying close enough attention to find them. He didn't apologize out loud, but he stopped smirking, permanently. And when Ashley spoke after that, he listened. She was no longer an outsider. The crew was with her. That mattered. But it wasn't enough. And Ashley knew it before anyone else had time to feel the brief warmth of unity before the cold reality of the situation reasserted itself. Barnaby Thorne was not a man you defeated with journal entries and soil samples shown to a handful of ranch hands who were already predisposed to believe you. He had money that reached into the bank, connections that reached into the county offices, and a lawyer in Cheyenne who had made problems like this disappear before. Evidence that couldn't survive a single dismissive courtroom morning wasn't evidence. It was paper. She needed something that would hold, something public, something documented through channels Thorne couldn't quietly pressure, something that forced the situation into the open before he had time to respond. Was it criminal genius? Or had Thorne simply never expected anyone on that ranch to be smart enough to notice? 3 days before the harvest social, Ashley opened the one bag she hadn't unpacked. The silk dress had survived the journey west better than anyone might have expected. wrapped in brown paper, stored flat, untouched, since the day she arrived in Broken Bow, and the town had laughed at it. She shook it out in her room. I examined it in the small square of mirror above the washstand, and began the careful work of pressing it back into its original shape with a flat iron borrowed from the kitchen. Old Thad found her at it and stopped in the doorway with an expression of open confusion. "Going somewhere?" he asked. "The harvest social," she said, without looking up from the iron. "You sure that's wise? Thorne will be there." "Yes," Ashley said. "He will." She said it the way someone confirms a fact they have already built a plan around. Not with bravado, not with nerves, but with the settled calm of a person who has been preparing for a specific moment and has just been told it is arriving on schedule. The Harvest Social was the county's annual attempt at civilization. Long tables set in the town square, lanterns strung between the posts, a fiddle music competing with the wind off the mountains. Every family within riding distance came. It was the kind of event where reputations were made and adjusted and quietly destroyed over plates of food and glasses of something stronger than lemonade. Ashley arrived on Silas's arm. The town's reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. Heads turned, conversations dropped half a register. The women who had whispered on the day of her arrival whispered again now, though the content had shifted slightly. The silk dress, on closer inspection, was finer than anything else in the square, and she wore it with a composure that was harder to mock than dusty confusion had been. But the general consensus held. She was still Silas Vance's decorative mistake, the Philadelphia ornament he'd saddled himself with in a moment of desperate poor judgment. They had no idea what she was about to do. Barnaby Thorne was not what his reputation suggested he should look like. He wasn't large or physically threatening. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with well-cut clothes and the kind of controlled, deliberate manner that comes from decades of getting what he wants without ever having to raise his voice to get it. His hair was silver at the temples. His handshake, when Silas was obligated to exchange it, was brief and dry and communicated a very clear message: that he considered the social niceties of this interaction a minor inconvenience on the way to an outcome he had already decided, for he looked at Ashley the way men like him always looked at women in his social calculations. A single, assessing glance that catalogued and dismissed in the same motion. Decorative, irrelevant, not a factor. He turned his attention back to Silas and began a conversation about land values in the northern county. The particular kind of conversation that sounds like small talk and is actually a slow, patient form of pressure. Ashley listened, said nothing, and waited. She chose her moment with the precision of someone who has been timing it since they walked through the gate. During a pause, the brief lull when Silas excused himself to speak with another rancher, and Thorne was momentarily without an audience, Ashley turned to him with the expression of a woman making pleasant conversation at a social event and said, quite casually, that she had found the local plant life absolutely fascinating since her arrival. Thorne responded with a polite, minimal engagement of a man who considers the topic and its speaker equally unimportant. She pressed gently. Had he noticed the silvery lupine growth along the northern creek corridors? Remarkable density for this late in the season. She'd never seen anything quite like it in her botanical reading. Something shifted in Thorne's expression. Barely. A tightening at the corners of his eyes that lasted less than a second before the controlled pleasantness reasserted itself. "Can't say I've paid it much attention," he said. "No," Ashley agreed pleasantly. I don't suppose you would." She let a brief silence sit between them, just long enough to be uncomfortable, and then mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had sent soil and water samples to the university in St. Louis for analysis. She watched his face the way she watched symptom presentation in a sick animal, calmly, completely, missing nothing. "I also wrote to the territorial marshal last week," she continued, her tone unchanged, her expression that of a woman discussing the weather, "regarding what I believe may constitute criminal negligence in relation to livestock contamination." He was quite interested. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Barnaby Thorne's arrogance, that smooth, impenetrable, decades-built arrogance, cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone watching from a distance. But Ashley was not watching from a distance. She saw the slight stiffening in his jaw, the fractional change in his breathing, the way his eyes moved, just once, quickly, toward the northern horizon, as though involuntarily checking something. A guilty man's tells are small, but they are there if you know what you're looking for. She smiled warmly, excused herself with perfect composure, and walked back to Silas's side without looking back once. Silas had watched the entire exchange from 12 feet away. He hadn't heard what was said. The fiddle music and the crowd noise had seen to that. But he had watched Ashley's face and Thorne's face across the distance with the focused attention of a man who has learned to read situations when he can't read the words inside them. He had seen Thorne's expression change. He had seen Ashley smile. He said nothing when she returned to his side. Nothing about what she'd done. Nothing about what he'd watched happen. But something in the set of his face had shifted, and the way he looked at her now was not the way a man looks at a mistake he is managing. It was a bluff. The samples were still in her chest. The marshal hadn't been contacted, but she'd just watched a guilty man sweat. Have you ever watched someone underestimate you and used it against them? Ashley did exactly that. Thorne didn't wait long. That was the thing about men who operated through calculated patience. When patience stopped being useful, they moved fast and without warning. The harvest social had been on a Friday. The fire came the following Monday. I'm in the dead hours between midnight and dawn when the ranch was at its most vulnerable, and the men in the bunkhouse were at their deepest sleep. It was one of the younger hands who smelled it first. That particular wrongness of smoke where smoke had no business being, and came out of the bunkhouse already shouting before he was fully awake. By the time Silas hit the yard, the barn's eastern wall was fully involved. The fire moved the way fire moves when it has been helped along. Fast, purposeful, hungry, in a way that natural accident rarely produces. Later, boot prints would be found along the northern fence line, and a broken lantern would turn up in the scrub 50 yards from the barn door. But that was later. Right now, there was only the roar of it and the screaming of animals inside, and they came out of the darkness at the tree line. 4 of them, moving in the deliberate, unhurried way of men who've been paid enough to feel untouchable. Silas Vance, no blood relation to Silas, just a name that Thorne had found useful for the irony of it, led them. He was a hired gun of the practical variety, not the theatrical kind. No speeches, no warnings. He positioned his men at the water trough and the tool shed, making sure the fire had room to do its work without interference, and watched the barn burn with the expression of a man clocking a job toward completion. What he hadn't accounted for was the woman who came out of the main house, not in panic, but in motion. Already moving toward the barn with a purpose that didn't look like rescue instinct. It looked like command, He watched her for a moment, recalculating. Then Silas and the hands came pouring out of the bunkhouse, and Silas Vance made the practical decision to melt back into the tree line before the odds got worse. Ashley reached the barn door and felt the heat against her face like a physical wall. She could hear the calves, the young ones penned in the eastern stall, the ones she had been monitoring for secondary lupine exposure, the ones that represented whatever breeding future the Ironwood had left after months of losses. Their panic was audible above the roar of the fire, high and desperate, and absolutely clear about what was happening to them. She also knew exactly where her medical chest was. She had moved it to the barn 3 days ago. A decision made for practical reasons that now felt like the worst judgment call of her life. It was against the western wall, away from the initial burn, but the fire was moving and moving fast, and she had perhaps 2 minutes before that wall went with everything against it. Her instruments, her father's journals, 12 years of accumulated knowledge in his handwriting and hers, every case study, every procedure, every piece of her education that the world had tried to take from her, and that she had carried west in a locked box, because it was the only proof she had that she was who she knew herself to be. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then she went in for the calves. She got 7 of the 9 calves out. It took 4 trips into heat that was past the point of reasonable, and with a wet feed sack over her head, and Gideon Cross, who had appeared at her shoulder without being asked and stayed without being told, taking the animals from her arms at the door and moving them clear of the structure. The chest burned. She knew it the moment the western wall went. A single, clean collapse that sent a column of sparks 40 feet into the dark sky and removed any remaining question about what had survived and what hadn't. She was standing in the yard when it happened, coughing smoke out of her lungs, and she watched it go with the face of someone absorbing a loss they had already decided. In the doorway, 3 minutes ago, they could survive. One thing made it out: a single glass vial, the one she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since the morning she'd mapped the seed trail to Thorne's fence line. Blackened by heat, intact. Silas found her in the center of the yard when the worst of it was over. He had been bracing for what came after a woman lost everything she'd carried across a continent. The collapse, the grief, the breaking point that he, in her position, might not have been far from himself. He had a speech half-formed in his head about rebuilding, about what could be replaced, about... She was directing the hands, not sitting, not weeping. Standing in the yard with soot across her face, and her hair loose from its pins, and her voice absolutely steady, telling old Thad which cattle needed to move and where they needed to go before morning. The Rimrock pasture, she was saying when Silas reached her. The north face. Silas has written it off as useless. It isn't. The elevation keeps it clear of the lupine distribution pattern. Move them tonight, before Thorne sends anyone back to check what survived. Old Thad was already moving. Gideon Cross was already moving. The crew followed her without question or hesitation, and Silas stood very still for a moment, watching that happen, absorbing the full weight of when it must have changed without him noticing. He had looked at Ashley Miller many times since her arrival. He had looked at her with disappointment on the street in Broken Bow, with confusion in the first week, with something approaching respect the morning midnight stood up in the barn, with the careful, complicated attention of a man who has realized his assessment of a situation was wrong, but hasn't yet finished working out how wrong, but standing in the yard of his burning ranch, watching his wife direct his crew through a crisis she had anticipated and prepared for before the first flame was lit. Silas Vance looked at Ashley Miller and finally, completely, saw her. Not the silk dress, not the locked chest, not the Philadelphia name or the soft hands or any of the surface details he had used to build his first useless judgment. Her. Ashley held the blackened vial up in the dying firelight and turned to look at him. Soot-streaked, clear-eyed, and entirely without defeat. "He made a mistake," she said. "He showed the whole county how much he needed to stop me." Barnaby Thorne arrived at the Ironwood gate just after sunrise. He brought 4 men with him, 2 inspectors from the county office, a local magistrate named Harlan Pruitt, who owed Thorne the kind of favors that accumulated quietly over years of strategic generosity, and a lawyer from Cheyenne who carried a leather document case and had the practiced, pleasant expression of a man who had overseen a great many forced signings and considered it an unremarkable profession. Thorne had dressed carefully. He wore his best county suit and rode a horse that cost more than most men in Broken Bow earned in a year. He had done this before, arrived at the wreckage of a man's life with paperwork and witnesses and the particular momentum of someone who has already decided how the morning ends. He expected to find Silas Vance at the gate. He expected to find a man broken by a night of fire and loss, operating on no sleep and the specific and grinding despair of someone who has run out of options and knows it. He expected to leave with a signed deed before noon. Ashley was standing at the gate when they rode up. Not Silas, Ashley. She was dressed in her riding gear, canvas trousers, duster, boots, still carrying the ash of the previous night. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. Her face was clean, but carried the particular tightness of someone who had not slept and had decided that didn't matter. In her left hand, held loosely at her side, was the blackened glass vial. She looked at Barnaby Thorne across the gate with the calm, assessing expression of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment and is not surprised it has arrived. Thorne pulled his horse up short. Something moved across his face. A brief recalibration, and the adjustment a man makes when the situation in front of him doesn't match the situation he prepared for. He recovered quickly. Men like Thorne always did. "Mrs. Vance," he said, with a smile that carried no warmth at all. "I'd like to speak with your husband." "He's here," Ashley said, "but I'll be doing the speaking this morning." She had reconstructed everything from memory. The journals had burned, yes, the instruments were gone, but 12 years of her father's instruction and 2 weeks of field documentation didn't live in leather bindings. They lived in the specific ordered architecture of a mind that had been trained to retain what it observed. She had spent the hours between the fire and dawn sitting at the kitchen table with fresh paper and a pencil, rebuilding every entry from the ground up, and she unfolded those pages now and laid them across the top rail of the gate. She didn't begin with Thorne. She began with the magistrate, Harlan Pruitt, who had the wary, slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who had come expecting a formality and was now not entirely sure what he had ridden into. She walked him through it the way her father had taught her to present findings, sequentially, specifically, without emotional language that could be dismissed as feeling rather than fact. The chemical composition of Lupinus argenteus and its toxic alkaloids, the physiological presentation of alkaloid poisoning in Hereford cattle, matched point by point against the documented deaths at the Ironwood, the concentration patterns in the northern troughs versus the clean southern creek samples, had the density of the seed presence relative to natural growth patterns in Wyoming Territory at this time of year. Not feelings, science. She spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. Then she laid down the maps. She had redrawn those from memory as well. The compass bearings she had memorized as she walked them, the measurement intervals, the specific fence line positions where the seed residue concentration had been highest. She placed them on the gate rail beside the chemical documentation and pointed to the northern line with one steady finger. The distribution pattern originates here, she said, and runs consistently north along the boundary fence. It does not scatter. It does not branch. It follows a line that terminates at the property boundary of Barnaby Thorne. She held up the blackened vial. This sample was collected from the northern trough 11 days ago. The alkaloid concentration in this single vial is 4 times what natural lupine exposure in this territory would produce. That concentration does not occur without deliberate processing and deliberate introduction into a closed water source. She set the vial on the gate rail beside the maps and looked at Harlan Pruitt. "That is not an accident," she said. "That is a method." Thorne had been silent through all of it. The controlled, calculating silence of a man deciding how to dismantle what he's hearing rather than actually listening to it. When Ashley finished, he turned to the magistrate with the easy authority of a man who has spent decades knowing his voice carries more weight than other people's evidence. "Harlan," he said, almost gently, "you're not seriously entertaining this. The woman has reconstructed documents from memory after a fire. She has no formal credentials, no institutional verification. She is presenting hand-drawn maps and a burned piece of glass as though they constitute a legal case." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough of a certain tone to make the word land the way he intended it to. "She is clearly a hysterical woman who has suffered a shock and is looking for someone to blame." The yard went very quiet. Silas Vance had been standing 6 feet behind Ashley since the gate opened. He had not moved, had not spoken, had watched Ashley lay out 12 years of knowledge and 2 weeks of field work in front of a magistrate who owed his position to the man she was accusing, and he had not intervened because she hadn't needed him to, and he understood that now in a way he hadn't 3 weeks ago. But he moved now. He stepped forward and placed his hand on Ashley's shoulder, not in front of her, not instead of her, but beside her, and the weight of it said everything about what had changed between them since a silk dress had stepped off a stagecoach into his disappointment. He looked at the crowd that had gathered at the gate. Ranch hands, inspectors, the lawyer, the magistrate, and Barnaby Thorne. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the yard and out into the quiet valley without effort. "She's not just my wife," Silas said. "She's the finest doctor this territory has ever seen, and her word is the law on this ranch." What happened next did not happen loudly. Thorne's hired men, positioned at the edges of the gathering with the casual readiness of men waiting for a signal, looked at each other, then at Thorne, then at the Ironwood hands who had come out of the bunkhouse and were standing in a quiet, deliberate line behind Silas and Ashley. Old Thad, Gideon Cross, every remaining man on the ranch. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The hired guns retreated to their horses. Harlan Pruitt looked at the maps on the gate rail for a long moment. Then he looked at Thorne. Then he picked up the blackened vial and turned it in his hands with the expression of a man who has just understood that the morning has not gone the way anyone planned. "I'll be ordering a full investigation," he said quietly, went into the land and water sources along the northern boundary. The crowd, many of whom had stood on that dusty street in Broken Bow and laughed at a woman in a silk dress, stood in absolute silence. The first frost came early that year, sweeping down off the mountains in the second week of October, and laying itself across the Ironwood's grazing fields like a clean white sheet. The cattle didn't notice. There were more of them now. The Rimrock herd that Ashley had moved through the smoke and chaos of that August night had been the foundation of a rebuilding program that had moved faster than anyone in the county expected. The Hereford calves that Gideon Cross had carried out of the burning barn were healthy and growing. The northern water troughs had been dismantled, relocated, and fed from the Southern Creek line. The grazing rotation Ashley had designed from her field notes kept the herd moving in patterns that left no concentration point long enough to become a vulnerability again. The blackleg deaths had stopped the week the Rimrock move was completed. The debt, restructured once the bank understood that the Ironwood's losses had been criminal rather than operational, was being serviced on a schedule that no longer required miracles. The ranch was not just surviving, it was building towards something. Where the old barn had stood, there was a new structure now. Silas had built it himself, with Gideon Cross and old Thad working alongside him through the late weeks of August and into September. A clean, properly framed building with real glass in the windows and a floor that didn't shift underfoot. It was larger than the barn had been, and its interior bore no resemblance to a livestock shelter. It had examination tables, proper lighting, storage cabinets built to Ashley's exact specifications, fitted with the instruments that had arrived in 2 separate shipments from a medical supplier in St. Louis. Replacements for everything the fire had taken, purchased with money that Silas had not discussed with her beforehand and had simply arranged. Above the door, fixed to a clean plank of Wyoming pine, was a hand-lettered sign that Silas had painted himself, working from Ashley's careful block letter draft. Ashley Miller, DVM and surgeon. The town of Broken Bow read it in silence the first time they rode past. Then they started sending for her. The territorial marshal's investigation took 11 weeks. It was not a comfortable 11 weeks for Barnaby Thorne. The alkaloid evidence from Ashley's reconstructed documentation, combined with the physical examination of Thorne's supply sheds, which revealed the seed grinding equipment she had predicted would be there, proved sufficient to bring charges of criminal livestock tampering and fraudulent land acquisition against 3 members of his operation. Thorne himself, with the instincts of a man who had survived previous legal pressures by knowing when to cut his losses, sold his county holdings at a significant loss and relocated before the second round of hearings. He left quietly. No farewell, no confrontation, no final move against the Ironwood. He simply disappeared from the county the way a bad season disappears, not with drama, but with the gradual, undeniable reality that it was over. His reputation in the territory followed him out, as charred, in its way, as the Ironwood's old barn. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of October, Silas and Ashley sat on the restored porch of the main house and watched the frost settle across the valley. They were not the same 2 people who had ridden 10 miles in silence from Broken Bow 4 months earlier. That was not a thing either of them needed to say out loud. It lived in the way they occupied the same space now, without the careful, managed distance of 2 strangers performing a contractual arrangement. They had come together through debt and desperation, and a newspaper advertisement that neither of them had answered for the reasons they had written down. What had grown between them was not the soft, uncomplicated thing that stories usually offered. Yes, it was harder than that, and more durable. Built from crisis and trust extended under pressure, and the specific intimacy of watching someone be exactly who they are when everything is on the line. It was a partnership, the unbreakable kind. Here is what Ashley Miller's story leaves behind. Not every person who underestimates you is doing it out of cruelty. Some of them simply cannot see past the surface of what you appear to be. And that is their limitation, not your identity. Ashley never wasted energy correcting that perception directly. She built her proof in silence, in the early mornings before anyone was watching, in the careful documentation that no one could dismiss because it was too specific, too technical, too grounded in the observable world to be waved away. She understood something that most people learn too late, that the loudest argument you can make is not a speech, it is evidence. Undeniable, documented, methodically assembled evidence that does your speaking long after you've left the room. That is a lesson worth carrying. And Silas Vance teaches a harder lesson because it requires something that pride makes almost impossible: the willingness to trust what you do not yet understand. He had every reason, by the logic of his world and his experience, to dismiss Ashley Miller as a mistake he needed to correct quickly. She didn't look like what he needed. She didn't behave the way he expected. She operated in ways he couldn't follow and made decisions he couldn't immediately evaluate. He let her work anyway, and that choice, made not from certainty, but from the desperate, uncomfortable decision to extend trust before it had been earned by conventional measures, saved his ranch, his herd, and a future he had almost stopped believing in. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is believe in what they cannot yet see. There is a version of Ashley Miller's story that ends at the gate. The moment Harlan Pruitt picked up that blackened vial. The moment Thorne's men turned their horses. The moment Silas spoke those words across the quiet yard and the crowd that had once laughed fell silent. That would have been enough. But the real ending isn't the victory at the gate. It's the sign above the door 6 months later. It's the town that once sneered now riding out to find her when their animals are sick and their children have fevers, and the frontier has done what the frontier does to the unprepared. It's what happens after you've proved them wrong and you simply keep going, because you were never doing it for them in the first place. The frontier didn't give Ashley Miller permission to be brilliant. She didn't wait for it. And that is the part worth sitting with long after this story ends. Not just the drama of it, not just the fire and the magistrate and the guilty man who sweated through his county suit at a harvest social. The part worth carrying is this: she prepared in private so that when the moment came, she was ready. The world's refusal was not her instruction. It never has to be yours either. If stories like this find you at the right moment, you already know what to do. Not subscribing yet? Drop a comment. Tell me what's holding you back. I read every one. And before you go, I want to hear from you on this. What would you have done in Ashley's position? Save the chest or save the calves? There is no wrong answer, but there is a revealing one. Drop it in the comments. And if this story moved something in you, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. They'll thank you for it. We'll see you in the next one.